In today's build guide, I'm going to show you guys how to assemble an awesome 4K gaming PC for around $2,500 in NZXT's updated H7 Flow, a case I've heard a lot about but I'm yet to try. I'll be walking you through all the parts that make this build possible, why I chose the components I did, the build process so we can see what goes right and, well, what doesn't, and performance a little bit later. Let's do this. The Cooler Master GM2711S is a QHD 180Hz gaming monitor with Cooler Master's unique advanced reflectionless technology. The unique film reduces glare from ambient light, all while increasing screen visibility and reducing eye fatigue. The 2560 by 1440 resolution looks sharp too, while the 27-inch form factor is a real sweet spot for 16 by 9 gaming monitors. A 0.5 millisecond response time and ultra-speed IPS panel make this display competitive too. Learn more at the first links in the description below. And what better place to start than with the case, which is quite heavy. This is, oh my goodness, NZXT's updated H7 Flow. In many respects, this is fairly similar to the original H7 in that it's sort of a cross between a mid and a full tower ATX design. You get a tempered glass side panel, which is now easier to remove than before, but the big changes come with this bottom layout. Now you might think NZXT have removed the power supply shield, but actually what they've done is carved out space for the PSU here. That now sits upright or vertically rather than horizontally in the back of the case. That opens up room for fans, or I suppose even maybe radiators down here at the bottom. Motherboard tray stays in the same place. The whole thing is more blacked out. The cable cover is a little bit more all-in-one this time around. And one thing they have done, and I'll be honest with you, this is the bit I'm not that sure about, is this at the front. Now the new panels are edge to edge, a bit more seamless. I like that. Taking them off is easier than before. They're fully toolless now. But the bit I'm not 100% convinced on is this. Now this is NZXT's new all-in-one 360mm fan unit, and I like that they've combined 3 fans into one. I think it's clean. The bit I'm not sure about is this is actually room for, I think, 340 mils. So going for a 120 unit looks very, very small comparative to the size of the case. At Computex this year, I saw a lot of cases with new 160mm fans, so I think the least NZXT could do here on this not cheap Flow RGB version is give us a 420mm all-in-one unit or 3 140mm fans. Otherwise though, the design is pretty clean. The build quality feels genuinely very good. You can see ventilation here. Now this is going to be for your drive bays and of course the power supply, which now sits in this area here. That's going to increase power supply length, make PSUs easier to access, and it's kind of a cross between the dual chamber cases we see, which are like large fish tanks, and a standard ATX tower. I would say that cable management is slightly better on this one as well. 2 distinct cable zones with pre-run Velcro cable ties. I like that. And everything else is, as you'd expect, decent build quality and a price that's competitive in the market, but certainly not the cheapest option out there. My final thoughts on this case though are all going to depend on what it's like to build in. And for that, I need to tell you guys about the parts I've selected for this build and why. Now the CPU choice for this build was actually relatively easy. I wanted something high end, so at least 8 cores, and primarily good for gaming. This is a gaming PC build at its core. A bit of video editing now and again or streaming would be good to have, but it's not the #1 priority. Given some of the instability issues Intel CPUs are facing, particularly the i7 and i9s from 13th and 14th gen, that's those out the equation. And on the AMD side, buying a Ryzen 7000 non-X3D chip right now is kind of difficult to justify given the incoming release of Ryzen 9000. The 7800 X3D in amongst all of that landscape remains one of the best CPUs for gaming in terms of its pure speed and makes a lot of sense for this build. The 3D stacked cache makes such a massive difference and unlocks one of the biggest bottlenecks really gaming CPUs face, full stop. Now I'll be pairing this up actually today with an X670 motherboard. Now this is one of the only parts I would say that maybe you might want to think just a little bit about. Now X870 is on the way and we're expecting these boards to land at the end of September, start of October. Those boards are going to support Ryzen 9000 and 7000 and they're going to give you some more features. So we're expecting to see USB 4 on every single one of the X870 boards, as well as Wi-Fi 7 on pretty much all of the designs. You could also save some money in this build by going B650. This is one of the more affordable X670 boards though. Aesthetically though, it does fit with the build perfectly today. Not that that's the main reason you should ever buy, not just a motherboard, but any product in a build really. And it does have some pretty cool features. For example, I really like the inclusion of a Gen 5 NVMe and PCIe slot, should future GPUs ever need it, as well as support for DDR5 memory, and on the rear panel, a pair of high-speed USB-C ports too. Before installing anything into the motherboard, SSD is worth pointing out. I've gone for the Samsung 990 Pro, 2 terabytes one of my favorite drives if you're not looking at Gen 5 performance and Gen 5 cost. While for memory, I've gone for the XPG Lancer. Now this is a really nice 32 gig kit of DDR5. It's not too flashy, I like how modern the RGB heat spreader is, and the side profile of the RAM also looks pretty good, with a little bit of 3D texture here down the middle as well, just to give things that nice aesthetic edge. CPU is going to be first up. Of course, unbox the 7800X 3D, locate the triangle on the CPU and the motherboard, and drop the CPU gently into place. Secure the socket down. It needs a little bit of pressure, but don't force it. Memory's next. Push back the clips on the second and fourth memory slots and slide the RAM in. Bit of pressure on each side to get it nicely clicked in, while the SSD is last up. Unboxing Samsung's 990 Pro, removing the integrated heat spreader with a screw on the left and the right. You'll need a small screwdriver for this stage, and securing the SSD back down into place. There is one more thing to do before moving this into the motherboard, and that's add this AMD mounting frame onto the CPU water block, and these included black screws around the CPU. These are what are actually going to go ahead and secure the top of the CPU cooler into place and create that nice thermal bond between the processor and of course the cooler itself. That's one of the big advantages of an AMD motherboard, is actually the pre-installed backplate. It makes life just generally a lot easier. A quick glance at the rear of the board and you'll see we've got all the standard ATX standoff locations, and a glance at the corresponding standoffs on the motherboard tray paint the same picture, meaning none of the standoffs here need to be removed. All that remains then is to go ahead and slide the motherboard in. Now the motherboard sits quite high up in this case compared to lots of other chassis out there, and I think one thing I'm worried about with this build is having just loads of dead space at the bottom. Fans and other bits may break this up, so let's see. I'm holding out my judgment until the build is complete. Then a simple case of putting all the screws into the motherboard, as I say, 3 at the top, 3 along the middle, and 3 down the bottom.
Meanwhile,
that wasn't what I thought was going to happen. I thought it was going to just separate. Oh dear, this is not a good start. The next component is obviously going to be the CPU cooler, but I'm also going to use this as an opportunity to assess the fan situation. Now, I mentioned this earlier, I don't get this at the front. I don't know how anyone can build a PC and leave that like that. To me, it doesn't make any sense, and it just looks silly. Thankfully, NZXT have the solution themselves with their F140 RGB cores. I'm going to put those at the front and fill it out a bit more, and use this fan array at the bottom, and another one for the radiator. The all-in-one cooler I've gone for is NZXT's Kraken Elite 360. This doesn't come with any RGB fans, so this universal unifan design, single frame fan, whatever you want to call it, is going to be perfect. So give me a moment to sort out all of the fans first, and we'll finish things off with the radiator. Installing the radiator then is all that's left. Got the nice unifan design on the bottom, pulling air through and out the case. I might lay the chassis down flat for this stage, start by installing the radiator at the top and then fastening the water block on. Thermal paste wise, this comes included. You need about a large grain of rice is a good guideline. The heat spreader on these Ryzen CPUs is not that large too, so don't feel like you need to overdo it. Next on the list is the GPU, and this is NVIDIA's RTX 4080 Super. Now to tie in with NZXT's fairly clean aesthetic, I have opted to go for the Founders Edition. It's one of my favorite cards out there, and while it's harder to get hold of than some other 4080 Super designs, I personally think it looks absolutely amazing. This one is also blacked out as well. The original 40 series and even 30 series cards are a grey silver. This is a much darker colour scheme, and that I think suits the H7 flow perfectly. A quick look at performance of this card shows why it's such an effective option at 4K. Ray tracing and DLSS are particularly great to have, and while the 7900 XTX from AMD offers similar rasterization performance at a slightly lower price point, I still think the 4080 Super is the better buy overall. Now it is a triple slot GPU, which does mean there are a couple more PCI slots to remove as well. Now for this build today, it's looking like we need to remove the second, third and fourth PCI slots, and I'm going to do this using the screws on the side. It's these very same screws that I'll be using to fasten the GPU back into place to keep hold of them and don't lose them. Always a good idea too to hold on to the PCI lane covers, the reason being, if you ever sell the case, you might want to pop them back in and return it to box fresh condition. A quick tap back on the PCI retention clip and the card should nice and easily slide into place. That is a perfect match. Bit of pressure, gonna give you a nice little click, make sure it's all aligned at the rear, and then use those same screws to fasten the card back in and make sure it doesn't go anywhere. The only remaining step then in this 4K all NZXT build is the power supply, and this is the C1200 Gold. Arguably I've gone just a little bit overkill on this, but I think it's the right pick for this build. It gives us some headroom and of course keeps the whole theme for the system too. It also is ATX3, so it comes with the PCI Gen 5 power cable needed to power natively the 4080 Super. The side installation is also a little bit novel, so go ahead and get this into the case, and then we're pretty much done. The only thing left to remain is to look at performance. But before that, I think you guys know what's coming next. So the build looks good, we get that, but what about performance? This is the bit, after all, that really matters. Now, the 4080 Super is undoubtedly one of the most powerful GPUs you can buy right now. And in the first gaming benchmark, Call of Duty's Warzone at 4K, that becomes pretty crystal clear. At high settings with DLSS enabled and set to the quality preset, the 4080 Super achieved an impressive 129 FPS. That breaks well through the triple-digit FPS barrier, gives you a competitive and playable gaming experience. In Modern Warfare 3, things were unsurprisingly very similar to very similar games in how they're actually made and designed. Here at 4K high again with identical settings, and the frame rate was actually higher, up to 141. So a 12 FPS gain, but nothing that's going to set the world alight. Starfield at 4K high was next. Here the build achieved an average of 83 FPS. Now the FPS has plummeted right down, but Starfield remains a really difficult game to run, so I was still very happy with this result. Hogwarts Legacy at 4K continues the trend of decent frame rates. Here at 4K high, the build did 86 FPS on average, again lower, but as an RPG, not a competitive FPS title, it doesn't matter, and the game at 4K looked visually awesome. A game where frame rate does matter though is Fortnite, which is next up. 1080p competitive, that's everything tuned down to low except the render distance, which was set to far, and the build achieved an average of 306 FPS. That's certainly not a frame rate to complain about. Apex Legends at 4K is the next title, again another competitive FPS game, but here I tried to run things at 4K high to see where this build really can go. The system did really well, 190 FPS on average, which I was really pleased with. Finally, to wrap things up, also tested out a bit of Cyberpunk because why not? 4K high, and again, these benchmarks are a tale of two halves. In these RPG non-competitive titles, the frame rate is a lot lower, 71 to be precise. The game though at 4K looks incredible, and the 4080 Super, in my opinion, has enough power to make a build like this a really awesome system for 4K gaming. If you want to check out any of the parts mentioned today, they will be linked in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, get subscribed to see more from me. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.